All right, so I think we're running. So, welcome to another episode of the Rediscovery channel, where our two armchair historians, myself, Dilger, and my buddy Ivor here, we rediscover history together. And the format is that each week one of us tells the other a story, something we read about and rediscovered. And the idea is that the other person doesn't know ahead of time what we're going to be discussing. So let's get right to it. And this week I want to talk about something very specific, but it's part of a larger thing. Have you ever heard of the war in the Vendée?
The war what?
The war in the Vendée.
No, that
So it's a
doesn't sound at all familiar to me, actually.
So actually, it's so the Vendée is a region in western France that
Okay.
lies directly under Brittany, which is also a very interesting place, by the way. I think we should do an episode about it one time because Brittany is a place where a lot of settlers fled during the Anglo-Saxon conquest of England. So actually, my wife has some friends from Brittany, and they came over one time, and they were talking about the culture there that's predominantly Celtic,
Yeah.
which is very interesting. But that's a whole different story altogether. The battle or the war in the Vendée is actually part of the French Revolution. Um, and I think the French Revolution is very interesting because it was inspired by philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau. So the people of the Enlightenment, um, and they founded an ideology that was later spread throughout Europe on horseback, pretty much by Napoleon.
Hmm.
But other than the beginning of Enlightenment, it's also arguably the birthplace of some of the darkest terrors of the 19th and 20th century. Um, and I think that the war in the Vendée is actually a very, very good way to go a little bit deeper and to have a look at it because um, actually, this is where most people during the French Revolution died. Um, because, and I think that's interesting because when you think about the French Revolution, you may think of things like the storming of the Bastille, right? July 14th, 1791. And later on, when Louis was in the Tuileries, that was 1 year later in 1792, where he pretty much lost all his powers and was, taken prisoner in Paris. Excuse me. So that was in 1792. A mob of angry citizens and volunteer troops stormed this holdout with the Swiss Guard. That was also very bloody and again something worth an episode. Um, the French actually told the Swiss guards of Louis that were there to guard him, even though he had already fled and went to the National Guard National Committee or he actually convention, sorry, national convention. um, the crowd stormed it because they wanted to take Louis and Marie Antoinette, but his Swiss guards were there, so the French shouted at them in German, surrender. And then the Swiss guards, about 900 of them, said, "We should think ourselves dishonored. We are the Swiss. The Swiss do not part with their arms, but with their lives." Uh, so that's pretty manly. Unfortunately for them, they didn't have enough ammo.
Uh-oh.
So actually 600 of them died in battle, and 300 were taken prisoner. And later, the majority of them died in what's followed afterwards is the September massacres. I don't know if have you heard of those?
Uh, September Massacre, it sounds familiar, but
So
probably.
basically, they took all these royals and priests and women and children, and they put them in prisons, kind of held them hostage. And then when they heard the rumors that they were being invaded by the Prussians and the Austro-Hungarians, um, they went into the prisons, and they basically slaughtered them all using pickaxes, sword, guns, and pretty much anything they could get their hands on. And yeah, it's pretty gruesome. So I think around 1,500 people died during the September massacres.
Hmm.
Um, they had these like makeshift trials in the prisons, but really it was just pretty much everybody was executed. Sometimes they were taken outside, and then they were like literally torn to pieces by the crowd that was standing there. So yeah, pretty dark, pretty gruesome. You may have also heard of the Great Fear, which is also very interesting. Was a time of peasant riots in the countryside, and they basically burned down castles, manors, convents, and other places to really get rid. Well, that was the initial reason, was to get rid of any evidence about what they may owe in taxes,
Hmm.
because they kind of wanted to burn the system down, literally, and kind of start over, which made me think of the movies Fight Club. um, anyway, pretty cool. Although, of course, not if you've been there. This Great Fear is also pretty well described in a book, Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, which I'll put in the link actually, because you can read it for free online.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to read that. I think actually when I was a teenager, I watched a movie about it, and I was never I can barely remember it, but like I was never that sympathetic towards the French Revolution when I was younger, and I'm still not that sympathetic towards it. I think, my views on ruling class type people, and I think that you do need to be aware of them, and because like when it comes to the ruling class, they are going to do whatever is best for them without thought or care for the most part for the regular people. And if they do happen to do something good, it'll just be because it lines up, that particular thing happens to line up with whatever is good for them. But I
Yeah,
hate the kind of things where, and I did know that about the French Revolution where they were smashing up statues and attacking religious institutions. I hate those kind of things where people destroy history and artifacts, because it doesn't just it's not just an act of malice towards whoever made those, but it's an act of malice towards the future generations because it makes it harder for them to understand and study the past. And also like we talked about the Assyrians earlier, and the Assyrians are probably one of the most sadistic people in the world, and one of the last people groups that I'd want to be conquered by. But I always found it shameful and unfortunate the way that ISIS was destroying their artifacts, things that have stood for thousands of years, because it makes the whole world a poorer place. Like, I don't have a drop of Middle Eastern ancestry in me as far as I know, but I don't have to be Middle Eastern or even from that part of the world to appreciate the history and the artifacts of it.
yeah, and
It's very.
that's actually exactly why I wanted to talk about this, because like when I taught history, it was we talk about Napoleon. He had a big impact with his civil code, which basically had a huge legal impact on Europe and really modernized things. And I definitely have an understanding, like, that was also, there was a lot of emphasis on the first and the second estate, the nobles and the clergy. And of course, like the third estate only had one vote out of three, so they were always outvoted. So it makes sense that there was a lot of anger. But what followed there was way more behind it. You mentioned some of the destruction, and in some ways, what we saw was kind of I would say almost like a secular jihad, right? Where they really wanted to start with a clean slate. And unfortunately, that clean start actually began with a genocide on Christians, right? Mainly in these rural areas, like in the Vendée area, which is western France, but
Hmm.
also other areas where hundreds of thousands of people were murdered in the most brutal way. Actually, a lot of people think about the guillotine and they think of the Jacobins and Robespierre. But if you look at how many people were killed by the guillotine, which was actually a way for the government to take back power, and it was a more civilized way to execute people.
Hmm.
That's the way they saw it, right? Because it was very quick and efficient.
Yeah.
And before that, it was just the masses tearing people apart.
Or lighting people on fire.
Exactly, yeah. So, they thought this was more humane, quote unquote. Um,
I
but
think it is.
it's an interesting because some of the darkness that's behind this part, it went way further than just a normal uprising, right? And we're still feeling some of the results today, and we've definitely felt them throughout our history. Um, so if so, actually, I wanted to put in a couple interesting facts about the guillotine.
Okay.
So I did some research, and the last time it was used in France was in 1977. Um, Interesting, huh?
That's not a
Uh,
surprise at
yeah.
all.
So and actually 4 years later, capital punishment was abolished in France altogether. I also discovered
Yeah.
that apparently the Nazis really liked the guillotine as well,
Oh.
and they executed an estimated 16,500 people using the guillotine.
The Nazis, that doesn't surprise me because I know one thing is they were trying to save bullets. Like when it came to executing prisoners and doing their genocides, like they would try to line people's heads up so that one bullet could pass through multiple heads.
Yeah, and actually, I'll have a nice quote like what they tried to do in France for similar reasons
All right.
to try and speed things up a little bit.
Who did they want to
So,
kill in France?
so in France, I really wanted to get rid of the royalists, right, and anybody that was still loyal to the church, and they ended up killing hundreds of thousands. Whereas in Paris, with all the riots and all the terror and everything, the amount of people that were killed was just in the thousands. It's maybe 6 or 7 thousand. It wasn't that much compared to what actually happened in this war in the countryside.
What were the
So
factions in this war?
yeah, so let me talk about actually about a royalist that played an important role in this war. Jacques Catalino. He was
Yeah.
a traveling merchant in the region, who, like many of the people around him, were absolutely horrified with what was going on in the capital.
Yeah, I would be
So
too.
in the Vendée region, the relationship between the three estates had actually been pretty stable, pretty good. Farmers, citizens, merchants, they were better off than in some other areas.
Hmm.
And moreover, they were deeply religious, and they thought that the treatment of the church was an abomination. And some of the things, so this is now 1793. And some of the things that they've already heard coming out of Paris was, the news of the execution of the king and queen, and how their young son was left to die in prison.
Mm.
The seizing of the Cathedral of Notre Dame,
Hmm.
stripped of its Christian symbols and enshrined a prostitute as the goddess of reason on the
That's
altar.
disgusting.
So there was actually a new cult that was started called the Cult of Reason that made this possible. So there was a revolutionary war. Yeah, that's so. Maybe I can tell a little bit more about it later. It was created by Joseph Fouché, And he had some other things done in, like, for example, just one of the things he came up with, because he really wanted radical de-Christianization. And like one of his orders was to write the words "death is an eternal sleep," to have them inscribed over the gates to cemeteries.
Okay. Go to sleep.
Yeah.
And why are you
Yeah.
bothering with your revolution? Just go to sleep. That's what it's
Yeah,
like it kind of reminds me they're going to call themselves they call it the cult of reason.
exactly. And
They said they called them, so they admitted they were a cult. But
yeah.
it's like one of those names that's really pompous but not actually accurate, like the democratic the what is it, the People's Democratic Republic of North Korea, which is none
Exactly.
of the above at all.
Yeah, or the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, the DDR, East Germany, right? So yeah, all these. Anyway, but so
Communist.
there was actually way more behind it, right? There was this fervent anti-religious sentiment, and these people really wanted to change everything, all the rules, including like rules on sexual freedom, right? Because they anyway, they really wanted to start anew. Um, and but maybe a little bit more about that later on. So Joseph Fouché, I read a book about him, an autobiography, or no, not an a biography by Stefan Zweig, an Austro-Hungarian Jew, actually.
Hmm.
And he described this guy's life as really just like a filthy kind of person. He was first on the side of the royals, then he was on the side of the Republicans, and later on he actually served under Napoleon. Um, anyway, interesting guy. He also had these ideas about luxury and wealth, that they need to be like abolished, and he wanted also to abolish the use of currency. So I don't know how he was going to do that. To be honest, I don't think it was going to be like Star Trek, but yeah. Anyway, virtue was to be the new like ideal above everything.
Right.
Um, yeah. Anyway, so the people, you can imagine that the people in the countryside were pretty upset. You know, the clergy were harassed. They were chased out of the country. They had to swear allegiance to the government instead of the church. If you're a Roman Catholic, that's a big thing. They took away all the property of the church. And then they actually used that money that they got out of there to fund their wars, which is
Mm.
kind of interesting. It's kind of like a not uncommon later on in modern wars, but it is, it had also been done before in the past. But anyway, and also they started the first universal conscription, right? The levée en masse, which meant that everybody had to pretty much go out and fight wars in the name of the Republic and die in the name of the Republic. So this Jacques, right? We were talking about this merchant, royalist. He was later to be called the Saint of Anjou. He rallied a small, ragged army of peasants, and he waged a guerrilla war against the revolutionaries. As time went on, his strength grew, and soon his forces were capturing villages and castles and some of the most fierce fighting. His troops were, first fought out of loyalty to the monarchy and the church, but later also because of the anger, because of the horrible and gross atrocities that were committed by the Republicans against the innocent people of the Vendée,
Yeah.
including women, children, elderly, even animals. They left nothing alive. Um, so actions such as these actually made them also to commit reprisals, so turn even uglier. Although they say that the former salesman himself always tried to, behave better and not, lower himself to such things. Um, so here's actually an eyewitness account from a Republican describing the horrors to his mother. Excuse me. All right, quote, "We will use steel and flames, a rifle in one hand and a burning torch in the other. Men and women all will feel the end of our swords. All have to die except small children." A few
Oh,
weeks
how nice.
later, he was wounded during the insurrection, uh, and then he wrote, um, so let's see, 52 of his fellows were killed there, with all with heads smashed in or with bodies run through with bayonets. And then he admitted to his mother that, "If I recounted to you the cruelties committed in the Vendée by both sides, your hair would stand out on end." Um, so yeah, pretty bad over there, right? And the story of Jacques actually ends kind of sad. So, which is how the whole uprising ended. So, when they were storming the city of Nantes, he was shot down by a Republican sniper, and without his leadership, they were soon defeated. His army, they broke up into different factions. And later he was called the Saint of Anjou, and his family was given a noble rank. So altogether, somewhere around 300,000 people were slaughtered in the war, dwarfing the number of casualties in Paris. And what followed was a period of revenge on the inhabitants that was incredible. Um,
Oh yeah.
yeah, so actually, excuse me. So actually, I have here an eyewitness account from one of the descendants, and it goes like this. So many were not even allowed to rest in peace. The body of the last leaders were cut up and distributed to scientists. The head was pickled in a jar, the brain examined to see where the seed of rebellion lay in the mind of a savage. And they wrote, "Not
That's so
one is to be
stupid.
left." Yeah, it is stupid.
Stupid.
Not one is to be left alive. Women are reproductive furrows who must be plowed under. Only wolves must be left to roam that land. Fire, blood, death are needed to preserve liberty. Their instruments of fanaticism and superstition must be smashed. So those were some of the words coming from the National Convention. And in the meantime, they had scientists that came up with new ways to do this, like poisoning flour and alcohol, water supplies. Um, maybe they could burn people in large ovens. So they were pretty brutal people, all in the name of this new, um, you know, this new cult of reason. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Anybody can tear things down, but there's only a few people that have the wisdom and intelligence to build things up. Like,
right, and that's the idea, right? Like what do you build after you tear everything down?
yeah, and the thing about these kind of people is they use words like liberty, and but then they want to kill everybody who disagrees with them, even people that aren't really looking to start trouble but just want to be left alone. Like, no, you can't be left alone. You have to submit. Like, why do I have to submit? And of course, this kind of thing is still going on today. There's these people that are still with us, these kind of people that will just not leave you alone, and they demand submission. And if they can do those things, like put you in an oven, then they will do it.
Yeah. So and actually one of the generals there, Carrier, he said, well, these modern methods were actually taking too long, and he preferred just the time honored methods of massacre. So there were mass drownings. Babies were thrown against walls. Prisoners being shot with cannons. Two incidents that I wanted to highlight. There was the drownings at Nantes. French city, which where the uprising failed. So at least 4,000 men and women and children were drowned here, referred to as the national bathtub. People were tied up and placed on boats that were pulled into the middle of the Loire River. The boat would then be sunk, or the prisoners thrown overboard to drown. Some victims were babies. Priests and nuns were stripped naked and tied together. They also called this an underwater marriage or a republican wedding. If anyone managed to survive being thrown into the water, they would just be drowned again the next day. And dozens of these drownings took place, where each time they would drown between 100 and 200 people. There were other unruly regions as well where there was rebellion. One was also around Lyon, a big city in France. And here there was a judge, jury, and executioner called Collot. And he really did, like, he created a bloodbath, which was, actually it's something you could see ISIS doing. He would, anybody that was, suspected of being a royalist would be lined up, or a religious person would be lined up in rows in front of cannons, and then they would be blasted with cannon fire. So, and they would load up the cannons with like cutlery, like any kind of metal parts they can find.
Oh, like a blunderbuss.
Yeah.
So
and then they would
weren't
line
even
them up in front of the kennel. And apparently in one day they claimed over 900 people lives on a single day. But can you imagine getting shot by a cannon? Or getting your parts torn out, and then you're just left there to die. So yeah. So I just wanted to, and I know we're getting pretty long here on the story, but I wanted to
People
look
seem
at.
to like that though. We got good views on the
Yeah,
last videos.
maybe people could let us know if they want shorter or longer versions.
Says anything?
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I wanted to have a look at the dark side of the French Revolution, right? Because to some extent, the whole motto of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, and later it became au mort, which means or death. How can you have freedom and equality at the same time? I think that's a question that's still relevant today. To the demonization of opponents, which was very common there. They had the press that was running rampant with, they were called libels, where they
That's
even
where
would
our
write
term
about.
libel comes from.
Yeah, and they would write the most
Slander.
slanderous, crap they could think of about, like, Marie Antoinette, and how she would be doing it with, like, it was the most horrible stuff. But they would get away with it, and anyway, so I think that's interesting. But also, it was the beginning of the rationalization of mass murder and the use of terror to push policy. Um, the deconstruction of culture through the cult of reason and morals, which I think is still something that's happening today.
Yep.
And to some extent, it was the beginning of the extreme version of nationalism that killed so many people in the early 20th century, as well as socialism that killed so many people in the 19th and 20th century.
Yeah, I would say to me that sounds more like communism than nationalism. I think Napoleon, he was more of a nationalist. I would say Joan of Arc was a nationalist, and she's one of my favorite French heroes. But
Yeah, so Napoleon actually he understood the importance of culture. Like
yeah,
people
I
like
like I kind of
Joseph
like
Fouché,
Napoleon.
he wanted to really destroy French culture and start from nothing, from scratch.
Yeah, that's gonna be
And
garbage.
Napoleon understood that you need to have culture to keep your empire together.
Yep.
That kind of ended there, but the roots are there, right? So that's an interesting part. I think a lot of that deconstruction of culture, a lot of those modern ideas are coming from this. Some of these cult of reason people, they would later inspire Nietzsche, and Nietzsche would later inspire, I mean, there's debates about how to interpret Nietzsche, right? But
I'm not fond of Nietzsche. I'm
yeah,
not
but I
fond
mean,
of.
like maybe his ideas were abused by the Nazis, maybe they weren't, but they definitely played a role there. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and also during the Soviet Revolution, they really looked at the Vendée War as an inspiration, and they saw it as like, oh, we need to use terror to keep these people down. That's the only way the revolution is going to work. And in Russia, they actually had several farmer uprisings in I think around the 20s, where they mowed them down with machine guns. And I got a nice quote here from one of the contemporaries of Lenin, Felix Dzerzhinsky,
Hmm.
and he wrote, quote, "We stand for organized terror. This should be frankly admitted. Terror is an absolute necessity during times of revolution." Um, so yeah, there's some of those thoughts. Nationalism was also, I mean, before that, I do believe it had a huge impact on nationalism as well, and I don't think the First World War could have happened in a world um, where the French Revolution hadn't taken place.
What do
So
you think the French Revolution has to do with? I mean, I'm sure, like in the flow of history, if you change one element, then things will unfold differently in the future.
the
But what is?
the mass subscription, conscription, right, is what you call it. The levée en masse. Everybody that's male had to report to the front.
But they did
Um,
that in the ancient world before they had professional armies. Like the Egyptians would do that too. Like if the king goes to war, he just grabs you from your little small farm and takes you with him. Maybe it's a big deal because it's been a long time since that system was used. Like you could say that uh, because once they
I
have
think it's also
professional.
like the part where like nationalism almost becomes a religion. And I think you also have to take God off the equation, right? Where God comes second, where it doesn't exist at all. But
Doesn't
like your
come at
first,
all. And
yeah, like number one is your nation. So
they're attacking their
I
nation, right? Weren't they destroying all the statues? And I mean, not all the statues, but they destroyed a lot. And they
some
destroyed.
of them did, but that was mostly in Paris, right, where you have the intellectuals, and they would do that. But outside of Paris, not so much.
Well,
Um,
if they're if you're trying to do a cultural reboot, then that's not really nationalism. That's attacking the culture and trying to replace it with something else.
yeah, yeah, but I would say that maybe they contributed to nihilism and
Yeah, for sure.
taking God out of the equation. Like you can't say for sure like what the results would have been. I read this speech from Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which is an excellent book, by the way, if you want to
Yeah, I
understand
still
more
haven't
about
read
Soviet
that.
Russia. But he wrote about the war in the Vendée as well, and he said it was the beginning, right, of this, of the terror that came over most of the world in the 20th century. And he said we never could have had those 180 million deaths um, coming out of those world wars without the French Revolution. And maybe it's not black and white, but I think there's definitely something to it.
I
And I think
disagree.
we can still hear the echoes of the ideology of enlightenment today, right? And to some extent, it is still a cult. Like it is still a religion to some extent about secularism,
Yeah.
where sometimes people act irrationally, or they try to rationalize things that don't make sense. Um, and that like I'm not gonna say it's like 100% this way, but I do think it's interesting to look at the French Revolution from a different light than the one that was presented when I was teaching about it, and then when I was learning about it, where it's like, oh, it's it's something to do with the estates, and the people were unhappy, and then Napoleon actually ended up doing a lot of great, cool stuff for everybody. Although so many people were conscripted and died, but in the end, it was probably a positive thing. I'm like, yeah, not so sure about that. So I think it may have been the beginning of a lot of bad things that we see today, and maybe a lot of those rights we would have gotten them anyway without the mass murder and without the crazy ideology. I mean, look at the U.S. You look at the United States. That was actually part of the beginning of the was when French people that came back fighting against the English over in the U.S. and they were talking about all these new ideals. The U.S. did it without a bloody revolution like this. So I think there's anyway. That's just my thoughts to it. Yeah.
So I gotta say something now, especially since you mentioned the American Revolution. So the thing is about France during that time period, and not just France, but most countries in Europe, is that you had an aristocratic class of people that owned all the land, and the average person was working land for somebody else. Like you could not own a house. Like no matter you couldn't get yourself out of you. It was hard to be truly independent. Like if you cannot be sovereign as an individual and own land, like there's no possibility of it, then you don't really have true freedom. And that's like one of the things that the French Revolution had a problem with, which I would say is a legitimate grievance. Because the thing is, in any period of history, you always have people that like when they become the ruling class, they instead of their top priority, instead of protecting the country, is to protect themselves. And time again, when they climb that ladder of success, they try to pull it up after them.
Yeah.
So and
No,
they'll do.
I agree with you 100%. That was legitimate. I just think that the ideology um, that was used kind of worked like as an accelerator for the fire, and because of that, they like I believe that even without this whole cult of reason and later the cult of the supreme being and without the radical versions of enlightenment, I believe that there would have been a shift in power um, gradually anyway. Um, and to add to that is also that people were starving, right?
Yeah.
And part of the reason was because there was a volcano eruption in Iceland, I think 2 years before, which completely destroyed their or most of their crops. So they had like it was like raining all summer long. It was too cold because of all the debris in the air, and people were starving to death. That's where you get that famous quote from "Let them eat cake" from Marie Antoinette, which is, by the way, not true. Um, but yeah, so there were other reasons that behind it other than the exploitation, which I believe is true. But I feel like they like it would have happened anyway. Things would have normalized, like like, oh yeah, they
They're
brought the
doing it again. Like
yeah, potentially, but look at what the Netherlands at the time. We had already we were a republic in the
mhm.
16th century already. It's not like it's impossible for them to rebel and to change things. And I feel like this idea of where they really wanted to change everything, and they brought in things like class warfare. They brought in like a world without God and things like that. It really
Yeah.
opened up some of the portal to some of the horrors that happened. mid 19th century to early 20th century. That's just. But I definitely understand why they were rioting, but there were so many ways it could have happened much more peacefully without destroying all those heritage and destroying churches and things like that. It didn't need to go like that. And part of that was also the king, right? The king was apparently he would have been diagnosed with burnout nowadays. Like the guy just didn't care. He didn't care about his job. He just wasn't fit to be a king. And then his wife, she was a total ditz, and she was like spending millions to live in the pretend farmland
Yeah,
somewhere off.
I heard about that actually. Yeah, my son, he brought home a book about the French Revolution. I was reading it to him, from his school, and it was mentioning that, and that's, so yeah, I agree with you that it opened a gateway for some bad things.
Mm.
But the thing is, and I still see like some of these same tendencies in France, like their revolutionary movements that they have are not principled. They're what's the word I'm looking for? They're vindictive. They're vindictive. They're not based on principle. They're based on emotion.
Yeah, but
So,
that's the thing. Is like they tried to rationalize it, right?
well,
Even though it was just about vengeance
what
for
happened
a large
is
extent.
they got
Mm.
demagogues, and you mentioned some of them by name. They got demagogues to come and take advantage of all the people who um, don't really have the like most people, they don't really come up with their own ideas. They run on emotion, or they run on what somebody else tells them, and that's where demagogues take advantage. But
Yeah,
like
and
the
that and
American
that's it. And they used
Revolution,
the press at the time, right? They would the press. They would print all these newspapers, illegal newspapers, but still they would get away with it.
so they
And nowadays you still have, like now it's the internet, right? It's everywhere. And and actually I read a little bit about the French press at the time. They would talk about something happening, but they wouldn't really talk about what happened, but they would
mm,
just use it as a reason to attack the church, to attack the royalists, any excuse they could find to kind of, to add fuel to the fire. And this was before the storming of the Bastille, so it played. I think it's an interesting thing. Like history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. There are definitely certain parts of the French Revolution or some of the dangers there that you see repeated today. Um,
Yeah, if you look at them today, they're having a problem with Islam because of their open borders policy. But the way they're treating it is they're not like saying, okay, these are the freedoms that we're protecting. They say, okay, we're going to crack down no religious symbols of any kind. And
yeah,
they don't.
that's laicism, which is it's just a French word for right secularism, where you try to keep any religion out of the state. But the thing is, like, Turkey was also very strong on this secular, having a secular state, keeping all religion out. So it's interesting to see the conflict that's happening right now in France. You had the beheading of the teacher recently.
Mm,
You had some girl that was being like she's still, I think, somewhere underground because she said some bad things about Islam.
yep.
So the question is, like, is France going to go a similar way to where Turkey has gone? Because Turkey was also supposed to be secular after Ataturk, but their secularism definitely didn't stand the test of time. So it'll be interesting to see what France is going to do.
Yeah,
But
I'm
I
also.
want to keep out of politics because it's doesn't age well, and I think the nice thing about history is that like you can talk about the French Revolution today, you can listen to about it, and I think you can still listen about it a year later, and it will be just as relevant. So I don't want to go into like the day-to-day politics, to be honest. Yeah,
Yeah, that's fine.
yeah,
Um, Yeah, but I think that whenever they have a revolution, it's never it's never based on principles or natural rights. Like they have more of a their idea of liberty is positive liberty, which is whatever the state says. You know, the idea is that the state gives you rights, not that you are naturally entitled to rights, you know, from God. Like our revolution in the United States says very clearly that the government doesn't give you rights. It's God that gives you rights. It's in there in the Declaration of Independence. And when the government violates those rights that come from God, then it's no longer legitimate, and you don't have to. You're not morally obligated to obey such laws or remain loyal to such government. But that view is also somewhat dependent on a religious worldview, and I don't see that in the French Revolution. And there's some people that want to compare our revolution to theirs, but the only really common basis for comparison is that there were French people involved in both because, France, they did help us with our revolution. They did help us get rid of the English. There's a guy, French general, Lafayette, who
Hmm.
actually trained a lot of our early colonists to fight against the English because most of them, I mean, they were all armed anyways. Like a gun was just a tool that everybody had back then. So, but they didn't know anything about fighting really. And he helped give discipline. And of course, the French had their own reasons for helping America. They had their own quarrels with England. Like earlier, they had the Hundred Years' War with England, so they were on kind of foul terms to begin with, which is probably why they sided with us. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah, and the
there's
thing is,
really
like
no.
the Hundred-Year War actually had a big impact on the Vendée region.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, so that's probably also an explanation of
wait,
why they were more loyal to the royal family.
does that fall into Normandy?
No, Normandy is more to the north. So Vendée is first, and then you have Brittany, and then I think after, if you go up north even further, it's Normandy. Um,
Mm.
but I did read about the Vendée region was, I don't know if they were actively fighting or if it was like right behind the front lines. So
The
it
English, they owned a huge chunk of France. Like in the past, Normandy went down all the way to Spain. Like they took the whole coast
yeah, yeah,
of
okay.
well, they didn't take it. They didn't take it, but they had it because of the Norman conquest. Because the Normans, they took over, they ruled that area. They were Vikings and they ruled that area, and then they went and they took over England, and then they ruled both areas. And then eventually, when the Anglo-Saxons reasserted themselves, well, they're not going to give up that territory, so France had to take it back. And let me just we're gonna have to put some maps into this thing.
Yeah, yeah. And Brittany is a place I'm actually excited to. I really want to go visit the place sometime because it's just so fascinating that they feel more tied to like places like Ireland and Scotland than
Yeah, because
France
they're the Celtic.
culturally. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
their cults. So that's cool. Um, yeah, Normandy I've been. It's I think it's nice nature and stuff. But yeah, I mean that's my story. Apparently in the Vendée region, some people still wear like black ribbons on the 14th of July, just as a kind of like a protest against the French Revolution. On Bastille Day.
Oh
Which
yeah, are they
yeah,
still celebrate the Bastille over there?
yeah, yeah,
Ugh.
yeah.
Yeah,
Which
I mean
the
they.
Bastille Day was actually like it's wasn't that there were only like seven prisoners in the prison. Anyway,
Yeah.
like the way they paraded those guards from the Bastille throughout the city was pretty gruesome, but not too many people died in that. But yeah, I guess it's the beginning of their revolution, their republic.
Yeah, I think they're.
I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
it's I think it's a wonderful country. I've been many times, and it's just so rich in history, and they have a
Sure.
strong culture. And it's always an American cliche. I think it's kind of like, oh, the French always run, but if you look at like what they accomplished during the Napoleonic Wars, um, we discussed the Battle of Tours already. Um, I think they've proven themselves in battle.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
I agree. I think the idea of the French always run is just based off of World War II, not off of the older history.
yeah, and I think World War One kind of broke their spirit even further because of the atrocities during World War One, the Great War, right? Yeah.
Dude, have you okay, you were right. The English, they ruled the northern part of France. Although it looks like they did possess some stuff on the west coast, it didn't run all the way down to Spain in an unbroken line.
Okay.
So, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I don't want to say something wrong, so without
Well,
correcting, but
there we
yeah.
go. But that
Yeah.
was my story. I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was a different perspective on a revolution that it's so deep, and then you get Napoleon coming after. I mean, larger than life figure.
I actually
Not,
kind of like Napoleon.
yeah, I mean the guy is fascinating. What he accomplished, like, and he was like a brilliant tactician, and I mean,
He had a cool
anyway, like,
costume too. Did you see
yeah,
it?
yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's
Him and
amazing,
Charles Martel, Joan of Arc. I think Joan of Arc and Charles Martel are probably my favorite French heroes, like French
mhm,
characters. But you got to respect Napoleon for sure.
yeah. Yeah, we could probably do like 50 podcasts just on Napoleon's life.
Somebody got to request that because other that wouldn't really. I mean, we both already know about Napoleon. It'd have to be like finding something about him that nobody knows, I
Yeah.
guess.
Anyway, that was my story, and like we said, we before, if you have any comments, leave them in the comment section. Um, there should be a link to the best places. So on BitChute, I think is our preferred place for you to leave comments. Let us know if you have anything you want us to discuss. Let us know what you think. Give us a like. Subscribe.
Before,
Yeah.
I bet I had a question that you never answered. Like,
Oh,
what did
okay.
the
All right.
Nazis? What did the Nazis do with the guillotines? What were they doing with that? What were they? Who were they like wiping out in France?
No, no, not in France. They were just using it in their own country.
Oh, really?
As far as
Oh,
I know, yeah, they were just using it in their legal, quote unquote, process
they were
to,
using it for the genocide, or were they using it to execute political prisoners?
I think, mostly for political prisoners and regular prisoners. I'm not sure if they were using it for the genocide. I can't imagine because, I mean, it sounds like it's like 16,000 plus people. It's a lot, right? But I mean, I don't know. That's a good one. Maybe
Yeah,
we can put it in the comments and let you know.
yeah, because
Yeah.
I didn't. That might be worth doing a video on because I didn't know that that they were doing that. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. Like they were like known for their efficiency. They would probably see that as a very cheap and efficient way to kill people. Like they're not spending bullets.
Yeah.
They're
And you live for 6 seconds after the blade hits your neck, and then
uh
it's over.
but
So
that's not as bad as getting burned to death.
yeah, or it's probably, I mean, as far as in ways to go, like, it's pretty surefire also, compared to how they did it in medieval times, where they would just take an axe and sometimes they would, kind of
Yes.
nick you. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not saying it was right, but there are probably more. There were definitely worse ways to go. You know. Anyway.
Yeah. No, I'm not
Yeah.
saying it's right. We're just talking about what they
Yeah.
did.
Yeah.
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 We
And,
could
and
do a
they
whole
and they
nother
thought and
thing
they
on.
thought it was like like a more civilized way of
I don't
doing
think the
it.
Nazis cared about
No, I'm talking about the
showing.
French. I'm talking about the French.
Okay,
I don't know about the Nazis.
I think the French were kind. It's. I mean, like they sound kind of like it's sloppy. Like the Nazis were brutal, but they were not sloppy. They
No,
were very
but
precise.
I do remember that they started using the guillotine in like 1936, so before the war even. So they were probably using it mostly for people that had like been condemned to death, stuff like that, like also regular criminals at first. So yeah. Anyway, we should
Mm.
probably put that in there. It's but yeah, there's I thought it was interesting and um what else that yeah, so Dickens, I'll put the Tale of Two Cities on there, Project Gutenberg.
Put it in
There's
the put it in the
yeah,
description so that our
yeah,
viewers,
yeah.
all 12 of them, which by the way, thanks guys for all you guys that are watching. But yeah, so everybody can also download who's interested.
And there's another book by this, I think, Hungarian Baroness. I think it's also on Gutenberg. It's also about the French Revolution. I think it's like the Red Pimpernel or something. It reads more of like a James Bond version set in the time of the French Revolution. It's easily accessible. It's good stuff. Free entertainment. Yeah, I hope you share some of our excitement for history and appreciate your time.
If anyone's listening at this point, they probably still do.
You would hope so, right? So yeah. All right, man.
Otherwise, they won't be listening unless it's a hate me. All right, well, good story, man.
All right.